Nobody seems to be happy with the way music streaming pays out. Almost every day, artists talk about not getting enough money to even survive. Taylor Swift, in protest of the low payouts, removed all of her music from streaming services for a couple years. And Jay-Z started the streaming service Tidal, with the idea of paying artists a reasonable amount. Songwriter Sam Barsh even offered a specific look into his own songwriting royalties. He earned a 12% stake in the songwriting on Kendrick Lamar's Institutionalized, off of the album To Pimp a Butterfly. This is a big song, and the album won a Grammy, but his 12% stake has only earned him $20,000. If a songwriter working with an artist as big as Kendrick Lamar is only making $20,000, just imagine how little all of the other songwriters are getting. The streaming services themselves aren't doing much better. Spotify's been losing money pretty much every quarter since it started. Its only profitable quarter was the fourth one of 2018, but the following quarter in 2019, it lost money again. And then there's the music labels, who will never be happy no matter how much money they get. So what's going on here? Where's all the money going? Let's go inside the industry and follow your monthly Spotify subscription and see where it ends up. Now, these numbers aren't exact, they're just the best ones I could find online. Now let's get started. In the US, a monthly Spotify subscription costs $10, but it's not that price everywhere. Some places like Sweden, France, and the UK, it's more expensive, and pretty much everywhere else it costs less than $10. For this example, let's say you're in the US and the end of the month comes. You give Spotify your $10 and it gets pooled with the 100 million other active premium subscribers to a total of $1.55 billion. That's billion with a B. Spotify also generates some revenue from all of the free users, from all the ads they listen to, but this number is a lot less than their premium subscribers. There's 123 million of these free Spotify users, generating $0.141 billion. All of this adds up to $1.69 billion of revenue for Spotify, taken from the first quarter of 2019. Notice that Spotify makes pretty much all of their money from their premium subscribers, almost 92% of it. This is why a service like Apple Music, which doesn't have a free option, can pay almost twice as much per stream as Spotify. At this point, your $10 is in a really big pile of money, and Spotify has to figure out how they're going to split it up and pay everybody. There's 3 different places Spotify has to send their money in order to stream music. The first one is obviously themselves, but the other 2 are more complicated, and this is where we get into copyrights. When a song is recorded, 2 different copyrights are made. One for the composition of the song, the melodies and the lyrics. This is the publishing copyright. And one for the actual audio recording, which is the recording copyright. And Spotify has to pay for both of these. First, let's cover how much Spotify has to pay for the publishing copyright, which is held by the songwriters, the people that wrote the song. Music streaming is somewhat unique, and Spotify has to pay 2 different publishing royalties. The first royalty is paid for the performance of a composition. This percent of revenues is unconfirmed, but it's somewhere between 6 and 7%. For simplicity, let's just say that it's 6%. Spotify pays this to a performance rights organization, who collects performance royalties. They take a 16.5% operating cost, and then give half of what's left to the songwriter and the other half to the publisher. If an artist is signed with a major label, the publisher is probably also the label, but this might not always be the case. So far, of the total revenues, the performance rights organization has 1%, the songwriter has 2.5%, and the publisher also has 2.5%. Now we get to the second publishing royalty, mechanical royalty, for the right to reproduce a song. In the US, this is set at 10.5% of total revenue, but legislation just passed raising this to 15% by 2022, unless the streaming services jump in and stop it. All of this 10.5% goes to the songwriter, unless they have some sort of deal with a label that gives away some percentage. A typical deal with a major label will see the publisher getting 25% of the mechanical royalties, leaving the songwriter with 75%. Assuming a songwriter has this deal, the mechanical royalties will get them roughly 8% of the song's revenue, and the publisher gets to keep 2.5%. At this point, Spotify has paid all of their publishing royalties, and has allocated roughly 16.5% of the revenues. The performance rights organization has gotten 1%, the songwriter has roughly 10.5% depending on their deal, and publishers have gotten 5%. Now we move on to the recording copyright, and this is where labels really get involved. I think that the pay-per-stream numbers you see everywhere refer to the payouts for these recording royalties. Spotify's payouts depend on a number of things, including how many premium subscribers streamed your music. but it's somewhere around 0.437 cents per stream. Apple Music, like previously mentioned, is almost double at 0.735 cents per stream. Usually as part of a record deal with a major label, artists give them the right to their recording copyright, and then get paid back some percentage, somewhere between 10 to 50% of the recording royalties. This means that the labels get to negotiate with Spotify to figure out what percentage of the revenues they get for the rights to use their recordings. The last time this happened was in 2017, and they agreed to take 52% of the revenues for their recording royalties. Depending on the split an artist negotiated when they signed their record deal, they could end up with anywhere between 5 to 27% of the total streaming revenues, and the label gets to keep somewhere between 26 and 47%. Now Spotify has paid all of their royalties, and they finally get to pay themselves with what's left over, keeping roughly 31.5% of the revenues. Now, with some assumptions, all of the streaming revenues have been allocated. The performance rights organizations get roughly 1%, the songwriters get around 10.5%, the publishers get around 5%, the labels get anywhere between 47 to 26%, the performer gets somewhere between 5 and 27%, and Spotify gets to keep 31.5%. That's a lot of numbers, with the revenues going to a lot of different places, but it adds up to 100%. Now that we have a layout of where all of the revenues in music streaming go, we can follow them to see how a songwriter like Sam Barsh would receive so little for his share of a song. Sam Barsh has a 12% stake in the songwriting credits on Kendrick Lamar's Institutionalized, off of the album To Pimp a Butterfly. By the end of 2018, Sam Barsh said that he had received $20,000. And after checking on Spotify, let's say the song had 43 million streams when he gave the interview. Assuming Spotify's pay per stream of 0.437 cents refers to the recording royalties, or 52% of the revenues, we can figure out that Institutionalized has a total streaming revenue on Spotify of $361,000. Sam Barsh is only a songwriter on the song, not a performer, so he only has a stake in the publishing royalties. If we assume there's a standard major label contract on the publishing, the songwriters only get 10.5% of the total revenues, and Sam Barsh only has a 12% stake of the songwriting, meaning that he only gets 1.3% of the total streaming revenues, or $4,700. Once you take into account all of the other places revenue could have come from, like live performances and other streaming services, this number seems like it could be around the right amount. The story of Sam Barsh shows how a lot of the revenues from streaming are cut out by major labels and publishing companies, but there are ways around this. Artists can independently publish a song to streaming services without having to cut a deal with any labels. This cuts out a lot of the players taking portions of a song's revenue, and the only person an artist has to pay is a distributor to put the music out. Some distributors like DistroKid take a flat fee, while others like CD Baby take a percentage. Let's work through the revenue flow of streaming services again, but this time assuming the artist both wrote and performed the song on their own, meaning that they get all of the publishing and recording royalties, and they use the distributor taking 10% of the recording royalties. First, an artist will take almost all of their publishing royalties, minus the 16.5% fee of a performance rights organization. This leaves them with around 15.5% of the revenues from publishing royalties, already way better than working with a label. Next up are the recording royalties, and after a distributor takes 10%, the artist is still left with 47% of the total revenues, and Spotify gets to keep their 31.5%. This means that an artist who wrote and performed their own song and uploaded it to Spotify independently is taking 62.5% of the revenues, way better than the 5 to 27% they would take if they were with a major label, although they do lack the funding and marketing power a major label can provide. Spotify has even started offering their own revenue distributions if an artist uploads directly with them. This cuts out a distribution service, and Spotify will give 50% of the total revenues to the artist for the recording royalties. This is slightly less than the 52% major labels negotiated, but the artist doesn't have to give any percentage to anybody else. Spotify still pays out the 16.5% for the publishing royalties, and they're left with a slightly improved 33.5% of the total revenues. A 2% revenue increase might not seem like a lot, but remember the total pool of money is $1.69 billion. So even 1% is worth around $17 million, and Spotify needs to do anything it can to try to turn a profit. As we can see, streaming revenue payouts are in a precarious balance. Artists are barely getting enough to make a living. Streaming services aren't turning a profit, and major labels will never be happy no matter how much they get. Everybody is clawing at each other's throats for even a couple percentage points, and it really seems like at some point something has to give. But for right now, the real winners are us, the listeners. For a small fee of $10 a month, we can listen to as much music as we want. That was a quick look inside the industry of music streaming payouts. I did leave out some fine points, so let me know if I made any wrong assumptions or what I missed, and where you think the money should actually be going. You can find the flowcharts I made of the revenue payouts in the description, as well as some other flowcharts I found helpful. Make sure to subscribe to Sound Selection on YouTube, check out the podcast on iTunes, and follow on Instagram.